Imagine living in a country where even your history is a lie, where every textbook, every museum exhibit, every newsreel is a masterfully fabricated fake. Sounds like a dystopia? Unfortunately, it's reality. And it is a reality in which we continue to live, even today, more than 30 years after the collapse of the USSR. Today, we will dive into the world of Soviet historical fakes. These are not just old mistakes, but a deliberate, cold, and cruel propaganda weapon that Moscow used to erase Ukrainian identity. We will examine how the USSR rewrote history, starting with the princely era and ending with the 20th century. Most importantly, we will show how these myths still influence the minds of millions of people around the world. Fasten your seatbelts. It will be uncomfortable, but truthful. If you are ready to learn the true history, like and subscribe to help spread the truth. Myth number 1, the oldest and most insidious. Kyivan Rus is not a Ukrainian state, but the common cradle of 3 brotherly peoples. The secret goal, to make Russia the big brother and the only legitimate heir. This is the foundation on which their entire imperial ideology rests. If this myth is destroyed, their entire right to our lands is destroyed. Let's face the truth. Kyivan Rus was not the USSR in the Middle Ages. It was a state that originated in the Middle Dnieper region, in the territories that are now the center of Ukraine. Its political, cultural, and economic center was Kiev. Not Suzdal, not Moscow, but Kiev. Imagine the 11th century. Kiev is one of the largest and richest metropolises in Europe. It trades with Byzantium and Scandinavia. St. Sophia Cathedral is being built here, rivaling Constantinople. And what is Moscow at this time? Nothing. Just forests and swamps. The first mention of Moscow appears only in 1147, and then only as a tiny border farmstead. Meanwhile, in Kiev, the Golden Gate already stands, libraries are open, and the daughter of our Prince Yaroslav the Wise, Anna, becomes Queen of France. Her letters have been preserved, in which she complains about the wild, uneducated Paris of the 11th century. So much for the level of civilization. Kiev was the center, and the future Muscovy was a remote, deep, forest-covered periphery. So Prince Vladimir, who baptized Rus in 988, was the Prince of Kiev. Yaroslav the Wise was the Prince of Kiev, and the language used there, Old Slavonic with local dialects, is much closer to modern Ukrainian than to Russian. This is evidenced by numerous chronicles, which the USSR then simply retouched. Of course, the official language of the church was Old Slavonic, the book language. But in everyday communication, in everyday life, the old Ukrainian language was spoken. For example, the vocative accusative forms characteristic of the Ukrainian language. As we say prince or brother, were the norm in Kiev, but completely foreign to the northeastern dialects from which Russian grew. There, in the north, in the lands of the Maria and VS tribes, a completely different linguistic melting pot was forming, with a strong Finno-Ugric substratum. Soviet science, of course, denied this, seeking any evidence of unity. They adored the Novgorod birch bark letters because they were not Kiev, but even they show a language that is very different from both Kiev and modern Russian. But how then to justify unity? Very simple. If it does not exist, it must be invented. Soviet historians, under the purge and control of the Kremlin, introduced the term Old Russian nationality. This term, which sounds very scientific, was in fact an ideological invention. It did not appear in the 9th century, nor in the 12th. It was invented in the 1930s and 1940s, during the era of Stalin's terror. Its purpose was to say, we were all one people, and then we split up. And of course, the Russian people best preserved this heritage. It was pure manipulation. No resident of Kiev in the 12th century called himself Old Russian. He said, I am a Kyivite, I am a Rusin. A resident of Novgorod said, I am a Novgorodian. Even then, they clearly saw the difference. But Stalin and later Brezhnev needed a historical bond to justify the existence of the USSR as a reunification of a formerly united people. They began to ignore the transfer of the political center from Kiev to the north. Remember how in 1169, Andrei Bogolyubsky, a prince from the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, which was then on the periphery, captured and plundered Kyiv? It was a real disaster for Rus. And here we need to pause for a moment, because this is a key moment in the rupture. Before that, princes also fought wars. But they fought for Kyiv. They wanted to sit on the Kyiv throne because it was the highest achievement. Andrei Bogolyubsky was the first who did not want to rule Kyiv. He wanted to destroy it. He came from the north with a coalition of princes, and after capturing the city, he did what no one had done before him. Even the Polovtsians did not do that. He gave the mother of Russian cities to his soldiers to plunder. The Chronicle says that they plundered for 3 days. They burned churches, took away icons, killed thousands of people, and took women into slavery. This was not just internal strife, as the textbooks wrote. It was an act of unprecedented barbarism. It was a deliberate act of humiliation and destruction of the old center by a new, aggressive northern predator. This was the first example of the horrific horde behavior of the northern principalities towards Kyiv. It was a civilizational abyss. And Soviet history did everything to hide this horror, calling it a process of feudal fragmentation. But the biggest theft is the name itself. The state with its capital in Moscow was never called Rus. It was called the Moscow Tsardom or Muscovy. Go to any European museum and look at the maps of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. You will see Ruthenia, that is Ukraine, and Muscovy, that is Russia. They are clearly separated. And only in 1721, after defeating Sweden, did Peter the Great issue a decree renaming his kingdom the Russian Empire. It was a brilliant but utterly criminal act of political raiding. He stole our 1,000-year-old name Rus to appropriate all its history, grandeur, and heritage. It was the biggest rebranding in history. He wanted to show Europe that his young, wild empire had ancient, respectable roots dating back to Vladimir's baptism. And to cement this fake, the empire and later the USSR began to retrospectively rewrite all books. They banned the word Muscovy. They began to call their state the Russian state retroactively. And the USSR legitimized this by declaring that Russia was the older brother and direct heir. And they didn't just steal the name. They began to steal symbols. They declared our trident, the coat of arms of Vladimir the Great, to be nationalist and fascist. And they made the double-headed eagle, which Muscovy borrowed from Byzantium, or, according to another version, from the Golden Horde, a symbol of succession. They began to ideologically Russify Ukrainian heroes. Prince Danilo Halitsky, who was crowned by the Pope, who tried to create a European coalition against the Mongols and tear Rus away from the east, became in the Soviet version simply a feudal lord who fought against Moscow's enemies. Let's go into more detail here. In 1253, Danilo received the royal crown from Pope Innocent IV. He became King of Rus, Rex Rus. This was an act of recognition of his state as part of the European community. It was a geopolitical choice. Danilo fought against the horde rather than negotiating, as the northern princes did. And what did the USSR do? They downgraded his status. In all textbooks, he is simply a prince. And the coronation? It was either ignored or presented as an insignificant episode or betrayal of orthodoxy for the sake of personal ambitions. His Western vector of development, his European ambitions were completely erased. Or let's take another example that the USSR preferred to keep quiet about, Prince Konstantin Ostrogsky. It was 1514, the Battle of Orsha. It was a grand battle in which the army of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, led by the Ukrainian Orthodox Prince Ostrogsky, completely defeated the huge army of Muscovy. It was a triumph of European tactics over the horde. Did you read about it in Soviet textbooks? No. This battle was simply erased from history because it destroyed the myth of brotherly peoples and age-old aspirations for unity. And do you know why? Because it shattered the myth of a common cradle. It proved that after the Mongol invasion, our paths diverged for good. At that time, while the Ukrainian lands, the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia, and then the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were integrating into Europe, receiving Magdeburg Law, when cities have self-government and are not subject to the will of a Khan, They had the Lithuanian statutes, collections of laws, not the will of one person, and had a different political culture. The Grand Duchy of Moscow was a ulus of a golden horde. The Muscovite princes did not rise to power in battles for freedom. They received a yarlik or license to rule from the Mongol Khan. They became the main collectors of tribute for the horde. They adopted the horde's model of power, autocracy, complete submission to the Khan, and then to the Tsar. They adopted collective responsibility, total control, and disregard for human life and property rights. It was Asian despotism. Ukrainian lands, on the other hand, lived under European contract law. These are two completely different models of civilization. To hide this difference, the USSR invented the old Russian nation. They needed to prove that we had always been the same, but had been artificially divided by the Poles, Lithuanians, and the Austrian General Staff. Today, when we hear that Ukraine is the historical territory of Russia, or we are one people, it is a direct consequence of this Soviet propaganda about a common cradle. They stole our foundation to justify their invasion. This is not just history. It is a weapon that is being used against us now. They say they are returning what is theirs. But as we can see, they are simply trying to rob Kyiv once again, as their real ancestor did, not Vladimir, but Andrei Bogolyubsky. Okay, if the theft of Kyivan Rus was the foundation, then the next stage was no less important. It was the rewriting of the history of the Cossacks. In Soviet textbooks, it was presented as follows. The Cossacks were a class of oppressed peasants who always dreamed of reunification with their brotherly Moscow people. Sounds touching, doesn't it? But let's look beneath this thick layer of propaganda. The USSR's goal was simple: to take the symbol of Ukrainian freedom, the symbol of the Republican Democratic Order that was the Sich, and turn it into proof that Ukrainians were supposedly incapable of independent life and always sought the firm hand of the Moscow Tsar. The main myth that was drummed into us was the events of 1654. The Pereiaslav Council, at which Bogdan Khmelnytsky allegedly forever annexed Ukraine to the Moscow Tsardom. The word reunification became a mantra. It was celebrated with incredible pomp, especially in 1954, on the 300th anniversary. At that time, arches of friendship between peoples were built throughout the USSR. Cities were renamed. Pereiaslav itself became Pereiaslav Khmelnytsky, and a giant arch was erected in Kyiv. All this was done to instill one idea in people's minds, that it was a happy ending, a wedding between two peoples. But in reality, friends, Khmelnytsky concluded a military alliance, or in modern terms, a protectorate. It was a necessary step in the context of a brutal war with a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which had already lasted 6 years. The Hetmanate was exhausted. Khmelnytsky sought allies everywhere. He negotiated with the Turks, the Swedes, and the Crimean Khan. And the treaty with Muscovy was just one of these temporary military alliances. It was a temporary agreement under which the Hetmanate retained full internal independence. Its army of 60,000 registered soldiers, its elected hetman, its financial system, its judiciary, and most importantly, the right to international relations, except with Poland and Turkey. All this was recorded in the March Articles. But what did the Moscow Tsar do? He immediately violated these articles. He began to station his garrisons, his voivodes, in Kyiv and other cities, which directly contradicted the agreement. They began to interfere in the collection of taxes and tried to subjugate the Kyiv metropolis to the Moscow Patriarch. Khmelnytsky was furious. Historians say that at the end of his life, he cursed the day he entered into this alliance and was already planning a new coalition with Sweden to fight against Moscow. But Soviet history, of course, is silent about this. In it, Khmelnytsky dies a happy father of a nation who has fulfilled his mission. And here we come to one of the names most hated by the Soviet authorities, Ivan Mazepa. In Moscow and the USSR, he was a traitor, a Judas, cursed with anathema. Incidentally, this anathema, imposed by order of the Tsar and not by church canons, has not been lifted by the Russian church to this day. But for what? For trying to save Ukrainian statehood. Mazepa was not just a hetman. He was a European-educated man. He saw how Peter the Great his then ally, was gradually turning the hetmanate into an ordinary Russian province. Peter violated all the articles of the Pereiaslav Agreement. He forced thousands of Cossacks to die building St. Petersburg on the swamps, and he sent them to fight for the empire's interests in Finland and Persia. And when the Swedish King Charles XII marched on Moscow, Peter refused to provide Mazepa with troops to defend Ukraine, saying, "Defend yourself." He was the first to violate the alliance treaty. When the time came for a major war with Sweden, Mazepa made a choice. He entered into an alliance with the Swedish King Charles XII, trying to use this war to restore full independence. Imagine his actions are not treason. This is a political maneuver of a leader who fought for his people. But the USSR portrayed him as a personal enemy of Peter, crossing out his huge contribution to culture, education, and church building. Mazepa is the Mazepa Baroque. This is the Kyiv Mohylo Academy, which he made the center of education in Eastern Europe. These are dozens of magnificent cathedrals. But most importantly, the USSR completely hid what caused Mazepa's transition. This is the Bachurin Massacre in 1708. When Menshikov, on Peter's orders, took the hetman's capital Bachurin, he slaughtered the entire population, 15,000 people, including women and children. They killed everyone. The city was burned to the ground, so that not even a memory remained. It was an act of genocide, the Bucha of the 18th century. There was not a word about it in Soviet textbooks. It was erased because it destroyed the myth of brotherly love. But the most audacious act of Soviet historical censorship was the complete erasure of the constitution of Pylp Orlik, Mazepa's successor. This is the year 1710. This document, created in exile, was called the Pacts and Constitutions of the Rights and Freedoms of the Zaporozhian Army. It was one of the first European constitutions. It was written a decade before the U.S. Constitution. It limited the power of the hetman, provided for popular representation in the form of the General Council, divided the branches of power into executive hetman, legislative Rada, and judicial General Court. It was an incredibly progressive document that proved that Ukrainian political thought was absolutely European. Why was the USSR silent about this? Because it proved Ukrainians had their own progressive ideas about statehood long before the Bolsheviks, and these ideas, democracy, limitations of power, human rights, were completely alien to Russian Tsarism and Soviet totalitarianism, where there was only the will of one dictator, the Tsar or the General Secretary. The history of hetmans after Mazepa is a history of systematic destruction. Hetman Pavlo Polubatok, who went to Peter to demand the restoration of the rights of the hetmanate, was thrown into the Peter and Paul fortress, where he died, allegedly telling the Tsar, "You will still answer for my death and the death of my people." And the final end to Ukrainian autonomy was put by Catherine II, who in 1775 completely destroyed the Zaporozhian Sich. And do you know how cynically she did it? This happened right after the Zaporozhians helped her win another Russian-Turkish war. They were her main striking force in the south. And as soon as the war was over and they became unnecessary and even dangerous as a center of freedom, she sent General Tekeli with a huge army to destroy the Sich. The last Kosh chieftain, Peter Kalnyshevsky, who was already a deep old man, was arrested and sent into exile to the Solovetsky monastery. He sat there in a stone sack for 25 years and died at the age of 112. In Soviet history, this was presented as the liquidation of a dangerous anarchic element and a progressive step that allowed the mastery of the southern steppes. In reality, it was the destruction of the last bastion of freedom and the introduction of serfdom in Ukraine's slavery, which the Cossack lands had never known. Thus, the Cossack Era, a symbol of freedom and statehood, turned into a lesson about how the older brother took the younger under his wing. And all those who opposed this, Mazepa, Orlik, Polubatko, Kalnyshevsky, were declared enemies of the people and traitors. Let's move on to the 20th century, the bloodiest and most distorted in the Soviet version of history. Here, the USSR brought its propaganda skills to the absolute. If in the 18th and 19th centuries they assimilated and Russified, Then in the 20th century, they began to physically exterminate any manifestation of Ukrainian identity. Their task was simple: to destroy the very idea of an independent Ukraine. Remember how we were told about the October Revolution? In the Soviet version, the Ukrainian People's Republic and then the Western Ukrainian People's Republic were puppet, weak, bourgeois governments that the people did not support. They supposedly collapsed themselves and were liberated by the Red Army. The reality is different. The UNR and the ZUNR were legitimate states created by the will of millions of people after the collapse of empires. They had their own money, their hryvnia, their own army, their own Academy of Sciences. They had full international recognition. For example, in 1918, at the negotiations in Brest-Litovsk, it was the UNR, not Bolshevik Russia, that was the first to sign a peace treaty with the Central Powers, recognizing its full independence. The Bolsheviks did not liberate them. They waged an aggressive, brutal war against them. And here we come to the myth that is still alive. Lenin created Ukraine. This is a colossal lie. Lenin did not create Ukraine. He fought against an independent Ukraine. And when he realized that he could not defeat it militarily due to fierce resistance, he created a fake, puppet Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, with its capital in Kharkiv, as a counterweight to the legitimate UNR government in Kiev. And then, having already seized the entire territory, he was forced to resort to Ukrainization in the 1920s in order to somehow appease the people. But as soon as the Soviet government became stronger, it began the methodical destruction of everything Ukrainian. The first blow was against the intelligentsia. This was the Shuted Renaissance. In the 20s, Ukrainian culture experienced an incredible rise. Mykola Khvailovy, Les Kurbas, Mykola Kulish, Valerian Pidmo-Hilnyi. These were world-class writers, directors, and artists. But their idea of a way from Moscow, which Khvailovy proclaimed, was deadly dangerous for the empire. They argued that Ukrainian culture was self-sufficient and should be oriented towards Europe, not Asian Russia. The empire did not forgive this. In the 30s, almost all of them were arrested, tortured, and shot. Their favorite place of execution was the Sandermak Tract in Karelia. By the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution, in 1937, over 1,100 prisoners were shot there in a few days, including Les Kurbas, Mykola Kulish, and Valerian Pidmo-Hilnyi. The USSR didn't just kill people, it beheaded a nation, destroying its brain so that no one could formulate the idea of resistance. The second blow was to the peasantry, the heart of the nation. No other historical event was so carefully hidden as the Holodomor of 1932-33. It was an act of genocide aimed at destroying the Ukrainian peasantry, the bearer of national culture, language, and identity. This tragedy simply did not exist in the Soviet archives. It was called food difficulties, collectivization errors, Kulak sabotage. Millions of people died from artificial famine, but only a few people in the world knew about it. It was not a random famine. It was a planned terror. There was the so-called Law on 5 ears of wheat of August 7, 1932, according to which a child who picked up a few ears of wheat from a frozen field could be shot or sent to camps. There were blackboards. This was not just a shameful list, it was a sentence. A village listed on the blackboard was surrounded by NKVD troops. Absolutely all food was confiscated from people, not only grain, but also potatoes, beans, beets. Any trade or import of products into this village was prohibited. It was a conscious mechanism of murder. And in January 1933, Stalin and Molotov issued a directive that forbade peasants from Ukraine and the Kuban to travel to other regions in search of bread. They were locked up in a giant concentration camp where they were to die. The USSR used complete censorship and fear to hide this truth. Even when the truth began to leak out to the West in the 1980s, Moscow continued to deny everything outright. It was the biggest lie of the century. And finally, the hottest topic that Moscow still actively uses, the OUN and the UPA. In the Soviet version, they were just fascist bandits working for Hitler, and their only goal was to kill civilians. The USSR deliberately hushed up the fact that the UPA was waging a war on two fronts, against both the Stalinist regime and Hitler's Germany. Let's get to the facts. Fact number 1. On June 30th, 1941, immediately after the withdrawal of Soviet troops, the OUN in Lviv proclaimed the act of restoration of a Ukrainian state. What was the reaction of the Nazi allies? Immediate. They arrested Stepan Bandera, Yaroslav Stetsk, and other leaders. Bandera spent 3 years in the German Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Here is Hitler's manual for you. Fact number 2. The UPA, created in 1942, fought both against the Germans and against Soviet partisans and later, against the entire punitive machine of the USSR. Fact number 3. In order to discredit this movement, the NKVD created special operational groups that disguised themselves in UPA uniforms. These groups, under the guise of Bandera supporters, committed atrocities against the local population. They killed doctors, teachers, burned houses, raped women. And then Soviet propaganda blamed the real rebels for these crimes. It was a vile strategy documented in their own archives, aimed at discrediting and isolating the rebels from the people. Fact number 4. The resistance was so fierce that the USSR could not defeat it militarily. That is why it resorted to mass deportations. Operation West in October 1947. In one day, the Soviet authorities deported over 76,000 people from western Ukraine to Siberia, mostly women and children, families of enemies of the people. They were not fighting the army, they were fighting the people. Soviet propaganda turned the heroic, albeit difficult, liberation struggle into a black and white story about traitors, so that no one could question that the only right choice was to be a younger brother in the USSR. And this resistance was incredible. The UPA fought until the middle of the 1950s. It was the longest guerrilla war in Europe of the 20th century. Even today, we see these Soviet methods, the labels fascist and nationalist, being used against us again. They have not changed their approach in 100 years. So what do we have in the end? The Soviet Union did not simply rewrite history. It created a threefold system of lies. First, the abduction of Kyivan Rus to justify claims to Ukrainian lands. Second, the transformation of the Cossacks into annexed to deny our centuries-old tradition of statehood. And third, the branding of any desire for freedom as fascism to justify repression and genocide. These myths are not just old pages in textbooks. They are ideological weapons that still influence the consciousness of millions of people in Russia and beyond. Our task is to know the truth, to know how the USSR tried to erase our identity and why it failed. History is not the past. It is our shield. And now, to make this shield stronger, I ask you, write in the comments which of these Soviet myths was the greatest discovery for you, and share this video so that as many people as possible learn the real story. Thank you for watching until the end. See you later.